Most fathers are afraid of the phone call that comes in the middle of the night. I got mine at 11:20 on a Thursday, 10 weeks after my son signed me into a nursing home to take my house. And when I saw his name on the screen, my very first thought, God help me, after everything he'd done, was that something had happened to my grandchildren. That's what a father is. You can throw him away, and the first thing he'll feel when your name lights up his phone at night is fear for your children. I answered, and my son Aaron was sobbing. Not crying. Sobbing, the way he did when he was 6 and broke his arm, that same helpless, drowning sound. And through it, over and over, he was saying one word. Dad, Dad, Dad. My name is Thomas Bennett. Most everyone calls me Tom. I'm 74 years old. I taught high school mathematics for 38 years. Algebra, geometry, a little calculus for the ones who could take it. 38 years of standing at a chalkboard, trying to convince teenagers that the numbers they couldn't see were more important than the ones they could. I never made much money. Nobody teaches for the money. I drove used cars until they died. I packed my lunch every day for 38 years, and my wife Grace and I raised our son in a small paid-off house on a teacher's salary. And we were happy. What nobody knew, what my own son never knew, and this is the whole heart of the story, so hold on to it, is that a frugal man who saves a little every month for 50 years and invests it carefully and never touches it ends up with a great deal more than anyone would ever guess to look at his used car and his packed lunch. I was, quietly, a fairly wealthy man. Nobody knew it, least of all Aaron. I don't say that to boast. There's nothing to boast about in living below your means for 50 years. It's mostly just stubbornness and packed lunches. But compound interest is the one piece of mathematics that feels like magic even to a man who taught it. And 40 years of a little every month, left alone and never touched, becomes a number that would have stunned anyone who saw my used truck in a Maple Grove parking lot. I never wanted the number for myself. Grace and I had everything we wanted, which was each other and a paid-off house and a son. So the number just sat there, quietly growing, waiting for the only thing we ever meant to spend it on. And every dollar of it for the last 20 years had been going invisibly into holding up my son's entire life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a son comes to sign his own father into a home to take a house. And let me tell you what he didn't know he was signing away when he did it. Before I do an old man one small kindness. If you've ever given everything you had to someone and had them treat you like a burden for it, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the person it was meant for. Give a like as well, and stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you a question I still don't have a clean answer to, and I need to hear how you'd have answered it. Let me tell you about Grace first, because I can't tell you anything true without her. Grace was my wife for 49 years. She was the warm one. I was the quiet one who was good with numbers. And it was Grace who started what I'll call the arrangement, back when Aaron was in his 20s and just starting out and struggling, the way young people do. Aaron wanted to start a landscaping business. He had more ambition than capital and more pride than sense, and he was too proud to take help. So Grace and I gave it to him without telling him. We paid off the loan that was strangling his new company, and we let him believe he'd had a good year. When his first big client didn't pay and payroll was due, money quietly appeared in the business account, labeled as a supplier refund, and Aaron never questioned it. When he bought his first house, I co-signed the mortgage. Grace convinced him it was just a formality the bank required. When the grandchildren came and Aaron and his wife wanted them in private school, an anonymous scholarship covered it every single year. For 20 years, Grace and I quietly held up our son's life from underneath. And we did it in a way he would never see, because Grace understood something I've come to believe is the deepest truth about love. She said, Tom, if he knows we're carrying him, he'll feel small. So we carry him where he can't see, and we let him feel tall. That's the gift, not the money, the not knowing. I could give you 100 examples, but a few will do. The year the drought killed half his contracts, Grace and I quietly bought a piece of investment land from him at 4 times what it was worth. Land we didn't want and never used, just to put cash in his account without it looking like charity. The winter his truck fleet needed replacing, a manufacturer's rebate program that didn't exist covered 1/3 of it. When he wanted to expand and the numbers didn't work, I sat up 3 nights restructuring his whole operation on paper, then had a business consultant, a former student of mine, sworn to secrecy, present my plan to Aaron as the consultant's own, because Aaron would never have taken it from his father. Aaron implemented the consultant's brilliant strategy, and it saved his company, and to this day, he tells that story at dinner parties about the sharp consultant who turned his business around. The consultant was me. It was always me. And I'll be honest about the cost of it, because there was one. Every time Aaron gave me that slow, patient, slightly pitying advice about money across the dinner table, "Dad, you've really got to think bigger. You can't just save your way through life." A small part of me wanted to lay it all out on the table. To say, "Son, do you have any idea?" But Grace's hand would find my knee under that table, and I'd stay quiet, and I'd let my boy feel tall. For 20 years, I chose his pride over my own. I'd do it again. That's the part he'll never fully understand, that the silence itself was the love. So Aaron grew up into a man who believed, with his whole heart, that he had built everything himself. The successful business, the big house, the comfortable life. He was proud of it, proud in the loud way of a man who thinks he did it all alone. And he came to see his frugal old parents in their little house with their used cars as people who'd never quite figured out how to succeed the way he had. He loved us in his way, but he pitted us. He'd give me advice about money, over dinner, in a slightly slow voice, as if I were a child. And Grace would catch my eye across the table, and we'd share the smallest smile, because we knew, and he didn't, and the not knowing was the gift. Grace died 1.5 years ago. Congestive heart failure, slow and gentle at the end. And when she went, I lost not just my wife, but the only other person on earth who knew what we'd been doing for our son. It became my secret alone. And it was in the raw, wrecked months after Grace's funeral that my son and his wife came to me with their plan. Aaron's wife is named Whitney. I'll try to be fair to her. Whitney married the life Aaron appeared to have. The big house, the successful business, the image. She never knew, any more than Aaron did, that the image was propped up by a retired math teacher. And when Grace died and I was grieving and alone in the family home, Whitney looked at that house, a modest place but paid off on a nice lot, worth a good deal in today's market, and she began, gently, to talk about what was best for Dad. It started as concern. That's how it always starts. "Dad, this big house is too much for you alone. Dad, you shouldn't be climbing those stairs at your age. Dad, wouldn't it be nice to be somewhere with people your own age, where everything's taken care of?" And I was so hollowed out with grief for Grace that I didn't have the strength to hear what a sharper man would have heard. I heard my son worrying about me. I didn't hear the arithmetic underneath. Looking back, I can see the machine being built, one gentle part at a time. Whitney started coming by to help me organize Grace's things, and Grace's jewelry, her good rings, quietly went into Whitney's purse for safekeeping. "Dad, you don't want these just sitting around." Aaron started handling my mail so it doesn't pile up, and after that I never saw a bank statement or a property tax notice again. They brought a realtor to the house once, introduced as a friend just visiting, who walked every room with her eyes doing math. When my old friend from a school district called to check on me, the call somehow stopped reaching me. Every thread that tied me to my own life was being cut, softly, in the name of taking care of the poor, grieving old man. And the whole time, I kept thinking how lucky I was to have a son who cared this much. That's the cruelest part of grief. It makes you grateful to the very hands that are going through your pockets. Within 4 months, they had arranged a place called Maple Grove, an assisted living facility, perfectly nice, the kind of place where the staff are kind and the food is soft and the days are very, very long. They handled all the paperwork. Aaron had me sign a power of attorney, just so I can help you manage things, Dad. Take the burden off you. And I signed it because he was my son, and because a grieving man will sign anything that a person he loves puts in front of him with a reassuring smile. And the day they moved me into Maple Grove, as I sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in a small room that smelled of disinfectant, holding a framed photo of Grace, my son crouched down in front of me, and he put his hand on my knee, and he said the words I will hear until I'm lying next to her. "This is for the best, Dad. You'll be happier here. Trust me, I remember the box on the floor beside me held 49 years of a marriage, packed by Whitney into a space the size of a closet. I remember there was a chip in the paint on the windowsill shaped like a bird. I remember that when Aaron said, "You'll be happier here," he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. And I understand now that even he knew, on some level, that it was a lie, that happier meant out of the way, and the best meant the best for the house. But I chose, sitting on that bed, to believe him. Because the alternative, that my son had just crouched down and lied to my face to take the last thing his mother and I owned, was more than a grieving man could hold that day. So I patted his hand, and I said, "I know you're looking out for me, son." And he stood up, relieved, and he left. And I sat there holding Grace in a room the size of a closet. I did not yet let myself understand. And then he and Whitney went back to my house, the house Grace and I bought in 1974, the house where Aaron took his first steps, and they put it on the market, and they used the power of attorney I'd signed to move the proceeds. And within a few weeks, the home, where I'd lived my whole married life, belonged to strangers, and the money belonged to my son. I want you to sit with me in that moment, friend, because I've had a lot of time to sit in it myself, in a small room at Maple Grove, holding a photograph. I did not fight it. I want you to understand that. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't make a scene. A man who has just lost his wife of 49 years does not always have the fight in him to also fight for a house. And a part of me, the part that had spent 20 years believing the not knowing was the gift, thought, maybe this is love, too. Maybe he really does think this is best. Maybe I'm the confused old man they say I am. For weeks I sat in that little room believing exactly that. And in those weeks, my son did not visit. Not once. He'd taken a house, and the visits stopped, and I sat with my photograph of Grace, and I finally, slowly, let myself understand what had actually happened to me. And here is where being who I am, being the quiet man who was good with numbers, finally woke up. Because there was something my son had forgotten. Or rather, something he had never known, because Grace and I had spent 20 years making sure he'd never know it. He had taken a house, but the house was the smallest thing I had. And every other thing, the invisible river of money that had held up his entire life for 20 years, was still, at that moment, flowing. The monthly transfer that kept his chronically unprofitable business breathing. The co-signature that was the only reason his bank hadn't called his line of credit years ago. The scholarship that paid for my grandchildren's school. All of it still running on autopilot, out of accounts my son didn't know existed because I had never told him, because the not knowing was the gift. My son had thrown away the one man who was secretly paying for his entire life. And he had no idea he'd done it. For the first time in 20 years, sitting in that little room, I asked myself a question, Grace, and I had never once asked. What happens if the river stops? If you're still with me, friend, do an old man that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I decided. Because what I decided is the part one still argue with myself about at night, and I want your honest verdict at the end. I did not decide it out of revenge. I need you to believe that because it matters. I sat in that room for 3 more days turning it over, and revenge never entered into it because you cannot take revenge on someone you love that much, and I did love him, even then, even there. What I felt was something quieter and heavier than revenge. I felt done. For 20 years, the money had been love. It had been Grace's love and my love, poured secretly into our son's life so he could feel tall. But love that is thrown in your face stops being a gift and starts being a wound you keep paying to reopen. And I was 74 years old, and my wife was gone, and my son had signed me into a home and sold the house she decorated, and I could not. I simply could not keep quietly funding the comfortable life of a man who thought I was a burden. Not anymore. Not with Grace gone and no one left who even knew what I was doing. I sat with the photograph of her that night, and I talked to her about it, the way I still do. I said, Grace, I don't think I can carry him anymore. And I swear to you, in the quiet of that little room, I could hear exactly what she'd say, because she'd said a version of it once, near the end, when she was clearer than she'd been in days. She'd said, Tom, we gave him the money so he'd never have to fall. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe some people only learn where the ground is by hitting it. At the time I thought it was the illness talking. Sitting in that room 10 weeks after my son threw me away, I understood it was the wisest thing she ever said. So I didn't stop it out of anger. I stopped it out of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a heart that has given everything it has to someone who kept sending the gift back marked return to sender. I call my financial advisor, a steady woman named Carol who has managed my careful little fortune for 30 years and is one of the few people alive who knows its size. And I told Carol to stop the monthly transfer to Aaron's business. Just stop it. And I told her that when Aaron's bank came to renew the line of credit I'd co-signed, which was coming up within weeks, I would not be renewing my signature. Carol was quiet for a moment. She's known this family a long time. And she said, "Tom, you understand what will happen if you pull out. That business doesn't stand on its own. It never has." And I said, "I know, Carol. I've known for 20 years. I built the thing that's holding it up. I'm just setting it down now." And I set it down. Now let me tell you about the next 10 weeks. Because I wasn't there to see them, I was in my little room at Maple Grove, playing bridge with a retired pharmacist named Walt, and slowly, to my own surprise, starting to heal. But I've pieced together what happened, and it happened exactly the way the numbers said it would. And I should tell you the truth about Maple Grove, because it surprised me. It was not the warehouse for the forgotten that I'd braced for. Walt taught me bridge badly, and I taught a widow named Eleanor how to do the puzzles in the math magazine she'd always been too intimidated to try. And for the first time since Grace died, there were people in my days again. My son had meant to file me away somewhere to be quietly forgotten while my house sold. Instead, in that little place with the fish tank, an old math teacher who'd spent a year drowning in grief slowly remembered that he was still alive and still useful and still himself. It's a strange thing to say, but Aaron did me an accidental kindness. He tried to put me out of the way, and instead he put me somewhere I could finally start to heal, which is a piece of the equation neither of us saw coming. The monthly transfer stopped. For a few weeks, Aaron didn't notice. He never watched the account closely, because it had always just been full. Then payroll came due, and for the first time in 20 years, there was no quiet supplier refund to cover it. He was confused. He scrambled. He put on a credit card and told himself it was a bad month. Then the bank called about the line of credit, and the loan officer explained, gently, that the co-signer had declined to renew, and that without the co-signer the bank was calling the note. The whole balance, a number Aaron had never really looked at because it had never been his problem. And Aaron, I imagine, said, "What co-signer?" Because he had never known. He had spent 20 years never knowing that the only reason his business had credit at all was a signature at the bottom of a page, in his father's careful teacher's hand. I've thought a lot about that phone call. The one where a stranger at a bank said the words, "Your co-signer," to a man who didn't know he had one. I imagine Aaron sitting in his office, holding the phone, the ground tilting under him for the first time in his life. He'd have called Whitney. He'd have said there must be a mistake. He'd have pulled 20 years of statements and started to see, maybe for the first time, all the refunds and rebates and scholarships and investment purchases that never quite made sense. And he'd have felt the first cold touch of a truth too big to hold, that none of it had ever been real, that he had never once, in his whole proud life, stood on his own 2 feet. The business could not survive being asked to actually stand on its own. It never could have. Within a month, it was insolvent. And the big house, mortgaged to the hilt, the mortgage I'd co-signed on years ago and had this time also declined to keep guaranteeing, went underwater and the bank began to move. And Whitney, who had married the life and not the man, watched the life evaporate and did what people who marry a lifestyle do when the lifestyle ends. She left. She took the children to her mother's and filed papers. And she was gone before Aaron fully understood that everything he thought he'd built himself had, in the space of 10 weeks, simply ceased to exist. Because the thing holding it up, the number under the line that he'd never known was there, had quietly been removed. And that is when, at 11:20 on a Thursday night, my son called me sobbing. I told you my first thought was the grandchildren. It wasn't until he choked out that they were fine, that Whitney had taken them, but they were safe, that I let myself breathe. And then I just listened. I listened to my son come apart on the phone, in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Dad, everything's gone. The business, the house, Whitney, It all just fell apart all at once. I don't even understand how. It's like the ground just, Dad, I don't understand what happened. I did everything right. I built all of it myself, and it's gone. And I'm sitting here, and the only person I could think to call was you. After what I did to you, you're the only one I could think to call. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. He kept saying it. I don't understand what happened. And that, of everything, was the sentence that undid me. Because I understood exactly what had happened. I had a spreadsheet in my head that explained it to the penny. My son was drowning and calling it a mystery. And I was the only person alive who held the answer. And the answer was that I had loved him so completely and so invisibly for 20 years that he'd been able to throw me away without even feeling the weight of me leave. I don't understand what happened, Dad. No, of course he didn't. We made very sure he never would. And there it was. The whole terrible equation, solving itself in real time. My son, who had signed me into a home to take my house, sobbing in the wreckage of a life he never knew I'd built for him, saying the only person he could think to call was the father he'd thrown away. I want to tell you what I felt sitting on the edge of that bed at Maple Grove, listening to him. And it wasn't triumph. God, it wasn't triumph. If you're waiting for the part where the old man feels vindicated, there isn't one. What I felt was the oldest, deepest grief I've ever known, deeper in a strange way than losing grace. Because I was listening to my son learn, too late and without even understanding it yet, exactly how much his father had loved him. And there is no lonelier sound in the world than a child sobbing in the ruins of a gift he never knew he'd been given. Now here's where the story stops being about money and becomes the hardest thing I've ever had to decide. Because I had a choice to make, right there on the phone in the dark. I could tell him everything. I could explain that the ground didn't just fall, that I was the ground, that I'd been the ground his whole life, that every good thing he'd ever been proud of building had been quietly funded by the burden he'd signed into a home. I could hand him the whole devastating truth and let it crush him. Or I could write the check. I could quietly turn the river back on, rescue him the way Grace, and I always had, restore the arrangement, let him rebuild and go back to feeling tall and never knowing. The gift, one more time. I didn't either, and I've gone back and forth 10,000 times on whether I got it right. I didn't crush him with the whole truth that night, because a man drowning doesn't need to be told how deep the water is. But I didn't turn the river back on either, because I finally understood at 74 that the river had been the problem all along. Grace and I, in all our love, had built a man who could throw his own father away and genuinely not feel the floor he stood on, because we'd spent 20 years making sure he never had to feel it. Our gift had made him hollow. Turning it back on would only refill the hollow. So I did the hardest thing. I said, Aaron, I'm going to help you, but not the way you think, and not with a check that makes this go away. You're going to come see me tomorrow, here, at the place you put me, and we're going to sit down, the two of us, and I'm going to tell you some things about your life that you never knew. And then you and I are going to figure out how you rebuild. Really build, this time from the ground, with your own two hands as a man and not a boy. I'll be beside you for it, but I will not do it for you. Not anymore. I love you too much to keep making you small by making you tall. He came the next day, and I told him. All of it. 20 years of it. The supplier refunds, the co-signatures, the scholarship, the whole invisible river. I watched my son understand, for the first time in his life, that he had never been self-made, that the father he'd pitted and signed away had been holding up every single thing he'd ever been proud of. It nearly broke him, but I stayed beside him while it did, which is more than I did the first time when I let him carry the illusion alone. I'll tell you the moment I'll never forget from that conversation. We were sitting in the little common room at Maple Grove, the one with the puzzle table and the fish tank, and I just finished telling him about the consultant, the sharp business consultant who'd saved his company all those years ago, the story he told at parties. And I said, Aaron, that was me. I stayed up 3 nights writing that plan. I paid a former student to read it to you because I knew you'd never take it from your father. And my son looked at me, and his face did something I'd never seen it do. It just crumpled completely, like a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on his whole life was a photograph of ground. He said, everything I was proud of, everything I thought made me better than you. It was all you, the whole time. And I said, Yes. And he put his face in his hands and cried in the common room in front of the fish tank, and I let him because some things a man has to cry all the way through. And then he said the thing that told me there might be a real man in there after all, under 20 years of hollow. He looked up, wet-faced, and he didn't ask me for money. He asked me, how do I learn to do it for real? That was the first honest question my son had ever asked me, at 44 years old, and it was worth more to me than the whole fortune he never knew I had. We're rebuilding now, slowly. Honestly, Aaron has a job, a real one, working for someone else, learning the business he thought he already knew from the bottom up. He's in a small apartment. He sees his kids on weekends, and he brings them to see me, and my grandchildren have their grandfather back, which is the only part of any of this that makes me feel like the numbers came out right in the end. He visits me now 3-4 times a week, not because a house is at stake, not because there's anything left to take, but just to sit with his old man in the common room by the fish tank. We do the math puzzles together. He's not bad at them when he slows down. Last Sunday, he brought the kids, and we spent an hour on a jigsaw, and he laughed at something I said, an easy laugh, a real one, and I looked at my son, broke now, humbled, starting over at 44 with nothing but his own 2 hands, and I thought he looked for the first time in 20 years like a whole man. Not a tall one propped up on a hidden number. A whole one, standing on ground he could actually feel. It cost him everything he had to get there. I'm not sure there was a cheaper way. That's the thing that keeps me up. Whitney is gone, and I won't pretend I'm sorry. A woman who leaves the moment the money does was never really there. And Aaron and I have something now, in the wreckage, that we never had in all those comfortable years. We have the truth between us. It's a harder thing to hold than the not knowing. But it's real, and it holds actual weight, and I've come to think Grace was wrong about one thing all those years ago. The not knowing wasn't the gift. It was the wall we built between us with our own love. The gift, it turns out, was the truth. It just cost us everything we had to finally afford it. I taught mathematics for 38 years, friend, and I'll leave you with the first thing I taught every class, every September for 4 decades. The most important number in any equation is the one you can't see. The hidden term, the one under the line, doing all the work that everyone forgets is even there. You can build the most impressive structure in the world on top of it, and admire your structure, and take all the credit, but pull that one hidden number out, and both sides collapse to 0. Every time, without exception, my son spent his whole life certain he'd built it all himself. He never knew I was the number under the line, and I pray to God he never forgets it again. Not because I want the credit, but because a man who knows what's holding him up is a man who'll never again throw away the people who love him and call it what's best. Now here's my question, and I mean it because I have argued both sides of it against myself for a year. When my son called me sobbing, I didn't rescue him the old way, and I didn't crush him with the truth all at once. But I've wondered ever since, was I right to let his whole life collapse first? Could I have taught him the same lesson without letting him lose everything? Or is losing everything the only way a man like that ever actually learns what holds him up? Tell me how you see it down in the comments. I genuinely don't know if I did right by my boy. If this story meant something to you, do an old man that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and go tell the quiet person in your life who's been holding you up that you see them. Don't wait until the river stops to find out it was there. Tell them now. I'll see you next time.